It was just another regular school day. The classroom was filled with the sounds of students talking, laughing, and getting ready for the next lesson. Some were chatting with friends, others were busy with their books, and a few were just staring out the window, waiting for the bell to ring. It was the kind of scene you see in most classrooms, kids lost in their own little world. But in the back corner, there was one kid who always seemed to stand out. His name was Jake. He wasn't the loudest, but he had a way of making his presence felt. Jake wasn't the friendliest kid either. He had this look on his face most of the time, like he was ready to pick on someone. He had a reputation in the school. Jake loved to make fun of the quieter kids. And today, his target was Tim. Tim was the kind of kid who always kept to himself. He was smart, but he didn't speak much, and that made him an easy target for someone like Jake. What the other students didn't know, though, was that the teacher, Mrs. Carter, was paying attention. She was new to the class and had been watching Jake and his behavior carefully. She wasn't one to jump into action too quickly, but she had something planned. Something that would surprise everyone. It didn't take long for Jake to make his move. As soon as he spotted Tim sitting alone, flipping through his notebook, he saw an opportunity. Jake slid into the seat next to Tim, a smirk creeping onto his face. "Hey, Tim," Jake called out loudly, making sure everyone around could hear. "Nice shirt. Did your mom pick that out for you?" He let out a laugh that echoed through the classroom. Tim looked down at his shirt, his face turning red. He didn't respond, but the other kids around them giggled, enjoying the show. Jake wasn't done. He leaned in closer to Tim and sneered. "What, are you too shy to talk now? Afraid someone might notice how weird you look?" The laughter grew louder. Tim's hands clenched around his notebook, and he kept his gaze down, hoping that if he didn't react, Jake would stop. But it didn't work. Jake continued, his voice growing more mocking. "You know, Tim, maybe you should just stay home. No one wants to see you wearing stuff like that." The more Jake spoke, the more the room seemed to fill with whispers and giggles. Tim shrank in his seat, wishing he could just disappear. It was clear that Jake was enjoying every second of it. And as the class watched, no one stepped in. They were all just waiting for the teacher to do something. But Mrs. Carter didn't move. She stayed at her desk, observing the scene quietly. No one knew it yet, but she had a plan. After the incident, things settled back into the usual rhythm of the classroom. The laughter slowly died down, and the students returned to their work. But Tim still looked uncomfortable. His head was down, his eyes focused on the pages in front of him, avoiding anyone's gaze. Jake, on the other hand, was sitting back in his seat with a grin on his face, clearly pleased with the attention he'd just gotten. But Mrs. Carter wasn't fooled. She knew exactly what had happened, and she wasn't about to let it slide. But instead of jumping up and scolding Jake right away, she waited. She kept her cool and let the class continue on with their lessons. Then at the end of the period, she called Jake over to her desk. The other students watched curiously, wondering what would happen next. Jake walked up confidently, his usual smirk still in place. "Jake," Mrs. Carter began in a calm voice, "I need your help with something. I've got a task I'd like you to do for me." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Helping him?" He didn't think that sounded too bad. Maybe this was his chance to get some special treatment. He leaned against her desk and crossed his arms, pretending to be casual. "Sure, what do you need?" Jake asked, still with that cocky tone. Mrs. Carter smiled. "I need you to collect the worksheets from all the students. They've finished their work and I want you to bring them up to me. Could you do that for me?" Jake thought for a second, then shrugged. "No problem," he said, eager to show off. As Jake moved from desk to desk, he noticed the students looking at him differently than usual. Some of them avoided eye contact, while others stared directly at him. It felt strange. Uncomfortable. It wasn't like before, when everyone laughed with him. This time, everyone seemed to be watching him, judging him silently. He couldn't quite figure out what it was, but something felt off. The task wasn't as easy as he had imagined. Every time he looked at a classmate, they looked away or stayed silent. For the first time, Jake felt like the one being ignored, the one being left out, and it bothered him. As Jake continued his task, the discomfort only grew. The more he moved around the classroom, the more he realized how strange everything felt. It was like the energy had shifted. Normally, when he walked through the room, people would greet him or even try to get his attention, eager to be part of his crowd. But now, it was different. When Jake glanced at one student, a girl named Emma, she quickly looked away, her face reddening. He noticed how uncomfortable it made her, like she didn't want to be seen with him. The usual confidence he had was slipping away, and for the first time, he felt small. It wasn't just Emma. It was everyone. He moved to Tim's desk, where the bullying had started. As he handed Tim the worksheet, he saw the way Tim kept his eyes down, not looking at him. Normally, this would have made Jake laugh, but today, it made him feel uneasy. Tim's silence was like a mirror. For once, Jake realized what it felt like to be the one ignored, the one who was pushed aside. Jake looked around the room, hoping to get some kind of recognition. But all he saw were students who were avoiding him, no one willing to give him the attention he was used to. It was like he was invisible, just like the way he had treated others before. And it didn't feel good. He walked back to Mrs. Carter's desk, his steps slower now, and sat down in his seat. His mind raced. Was this what Tim had felt all along? Was this what it was like to be the target of someone else's jokes, someone else's teasing? The realization hit him hard. He had never thought about how his actions affected others. He always just saw the laughs, the attention, and the feeling of power. But now he understood. And for the first time, Jake wasn't sure he liked what he saw in the mirror. Once Jake returned to his seat, Mrs. Carter stood up and called the class to gather around. She didn't make a big show of it, but there was something different about the way she spoke. Her tone was calm, but there was a subtle authority in it. The class quieted down, and all eyes turned to her. "Class," Mrs. Carter began, her voice steady and gentle. "I want to talk to you all about something important today. Something that affects all of us, whether we realize it or not. It's about how we treat each other." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, wondering where this was going. The other students, sensing something was up, listened closely. Mrs. Carter continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, making sure to make eye contact with each student. "Respect," she said, "is something that we all deserve. It's not just about being kind when it's easy. It's about being considerate, even when we're having a tough day. Sometimes we don't realize how our actions, or even our words, can hurt someone." Jake could feel his stomach twist. She wasn't pointing fingers, but it felt like the words were meant for him. Mrs. Carter wasn't scolding anyone directly, but Jake knew she was talking about what had happened earlier. The way he'd treated Tim, the way he'd made fun of him, all of it was coming back to him. He wanted to shrink into his seat, but he stayed still, unable to move. "Let me tell you a story," Mrs. Carter said, her voice softening. "When I was in school, I was shy. I wasn't the loudest, and I often felt left out. But I had a teacher who took the time to notice me. She never raised her voice or pointed out what I was doing wrong. Instead, she just made sure I knew that I mattered. And because of her, I learned the importance of kindness." Jake didn't say anything, but he started to think about the way he'd treated people. He realized how much of his behavior had been about trying to get attention, trying to be the one who stood out, no matter who he hurt in the process. Mrs. Carter's story was making him reflect on everything he'd done. And it was starting to feel wrong. "Think about how we all make each other feel," Mrs. Carter continued. "It doesn't take much to show respect, but it can mean everything to someone who needs it. So let's take a moment to think about how we treat one another. Do we lift each other up? Or do we put each other down?" Jake couldn't look at anyone now. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, but it wasn't the usual stare of admiration. No, this time it felt like something else. It was the realization that they were all watching him, waiting for him to understand. They had seen what he had done, and now they were silently hoping he would change. Mrs. Carter didn't need to call him out or yell at him. She had already done what was needed. She made him see his actions, without saying a word. The next day, something was different. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't obvious, but Jake could feel it. The usual teasing, the quick comments, the stares, all of it had stopped. There was a new quiet in the classroom. Jake sat down in his seat, scanning the room, trying to make sense of it. Tim wasn't avoiding him anymore. In fact, Tim smiled at him as he walked past. It was a small thing, but it meant everything. Jake didn't know how to react. He had expected Tim to keep his distance, to look down when he passed by. But instead, Tim seemed at ease. It was like the weight of the past had lifted. Just a little. And Jake? He felt it too. He didn't know why, but something about the way everyone was acting made him feel lighter. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. It wasn't the kind he had gotten by making fun of others. This was different. It felt more like respect. Jake wasn't sure what had changed, but he was beginning to realize that maybe he didn't want to go back to how things were before. As the day went on, Jake caught himself glancing at his classmates. They didn't seem afraid of him anymore. They weren't intimidated, and they weren't laughing at him either. The class felt more normal. There was an unspoken shift that had happened overnight. It wasn't a big, dramatic change, but it was enough. It felt like everyone was a little more united. Even Mrs. Carter noticed. She didn't make a big deal out of it, but Jake saw the way she looked at him. It wasn't with approval, but with quiet acknowledgement. It was like she was watching, waiting to see what he would do next. Jake didn't make a big speech or try to apologize to everyone. It wasn't like that, but he did something small. He started helping Tim with his work when he saw he was struggling. It wasn't much, but it felt right. And maybe for the first time, Jake felt like he was on the right path. Mrs. Carter never directly praised Jake for his change, and that was part of the genius of it. She didn't make a big deal out of his actions or force an apology out of him. Instead, she gave him space to figure it out on his own. Her approach was subtle yet powerful. She didn't yell. She didn't shame him. She simply made him see things from a different perspective. By the time Jake started to change, it wasn't because Mrs. Carter had told him to. It was because he had begun to understand, through her quiet guidance, what it felt like to be the target of cruelty. She had given him the chance to reflect, to feel the discomfort, and to realize that respect for others was far more valuable than the attention he once craved. The shift in the classroom was undeniable. The students were more thoughtful, more aware of how their actions affected others. Jake was different, but so was everyone else. The class felt more connected, more respectful. And Tim, who had been the target of Jake's bullying, no longer walked around with his head down. He held his head higher, knowing that the atmosphere had changed, and that he had earned the respect of his peers. Mrs. Carter's lesson wasn't about a dramatic confrontation or harsh punishment. It was about patience, wisdom, and showing someone the truth without forcing it. In the end, her genius wasn't just in how she handled Jake, but in how she helped the entire class grow, without anyone even realizing it was happening.